Hello there, coming to you from the bunker. This is episode 27 of Watchtower in Focus, the show that zooms in on all things JW, bringing the governing body and its teachings and policies under microscopic scrutiny. On Friday, September 13th, in a hotel conference room in Billings, Montana, the state Supreme Court heard arguments from Watchtower lawyer Joel Taylor in favor of overturning a landmark ruling a year ago when a jury declared Watchtower responsible in part for the sexual abuse of Lexi Nunez from the Thompson Falls congregation. The $35 million ruling, which came with a judgment of malice on Watchtower's part, was handed down because Watchtower elders had refused to report Max Reyes, Lexi's step-grandfather, after he had abused others, leaving him to continue his molestation spree. Present at the hearing and assisting Lexi's lawyers was Watchtower in Focus co-host Mark O'Donnell, who some still call John Redwood. Tonight, Mark will be sharing his insights on what transpired. Returning to the show after spending months in solitude studying the dark arts of perfect newsreading, is fellow co-host Covert Fade, and also returning to the show is friend of the channel and retired lawyer Kim Silvio. Mark, Covert, and Kim, welcome.
Glad to be here, Lloyd.
Good morning.
Episode 27.
Indeed.
It's
and
nice to be in the
Covert,
newsreading cave. Much.
Yeah. I understand it's very smoky in that cave.
It's very smoky. There's lots of bats. There's a strange little green guy with long ears who just keeps telling me in a strange voice to read news properly, you will. So it's all a bit creepy.
Well done for sticking with it, because it's all going towards your professional development, which we appreciate on Watchtower in Focus. And Kim, am I allowed to mention? I might as well mention for Watchtower in Focus viewers, and maybe they won't tell anyone else, but you have joined the JWsurvey team as our legal consultant.
I certainly have. Thank you for the invitation. I was very shocked.
So thank you very much for your help in that regard, and we very much look forward to hearing your insights as we go over this fascinating case. Mark, you were obviously there on the scene. You're also behind the scenes assisting Lexi's legal team. And from some of the things you've been saying, both on our WhatsApp group and on social media, it's clear that it was an emotional experience for you.
Thanks, Lloyd. Great to be here. Yeah, it really was. I think the fact that I had an opportunity to really spend a bit of time with the family, with the very strong women who have made this case a national and even international matter of record. It has really sort of reinforced in me just how important it is what these women are doing, both Holly and Lexi, in coming forward and filing this case and bringing this to light. These are very, very genuine people who are trying to get on with their lives despite having horrific abuse that had been heaped upon them by their stepfather and step-grandfather. For viewers that want a refresher on what happened, there were 3 victims in this case that we know of. It was Lexi, who was the youngest, and then her aunt, Holly, as well as Holly's brother, Peter, had been abused for many years by Lexi's step-grandfather and Holly and Peter's stepfather, Max Reyes, who, by the way, has escaped to Mexico before the trial last year ever happened, and is basically in hiding down in Mexico to avoid any sort of repercussions, prosecution, civil liability, what have you, notoriety. But they had been abused, and when Lexi finally revealed in confidence to her therapist that she had been abused. Effectively, what happened was all hell broke loose because at that point, Holly did not know that Lexi had been abused. And when she found out, she was horrified. And she knew she had to do something about it because it was bad enough that she had gone to the elders in 1998 and had told them that this man had sexually molested her. They told her, leave it in Jehovah's hands. We'll handle it. Don't worry. You know, we're your spiritual counsel. We'll handle this. And all the while, this man, Max Reyes, had also been abusing Lexi, who was much younger. And this really infuriated Holly to the point where she knew that she had to take action. And ultimately, she got legal representation from the Nix law firm. And Neil Smith and his team, as well as the Montana attorney and Neil's assistant, Tracy, have been working on this case for several years now. And they've gotten to know the family very well. And I'm very happy to say that I have, and they're just wonderful people. That it is horrific what happened, but it is such a credit to them, not only for being able to leave the religion behind, but to be able to stand up to Watchtower, a multi-billion-dollar corporation, and say, this is wrong. You knew what happened to Holly, and yet you still swept it under the rug. And at trial last year, the Watchtower attorney, Joel Taylor, effectively called Holly a liar and said, you didn't report in 1998, you're lying. This elder, Mr. Don Herberger, he wasn't even an elder until October of that year. So you're claiming that you reported it earlier in the year, you're lying. And then he accused her of doing it just for money, making the claim that she reported in 1998. And he even drew dollar signs on the whiteboard during trial and said, that's the reason why she's claiming that she told the elders in 1998. So we're going to get into it a little bit more detail later. And I want to mention right off the bat, I'm not an attorney. We're not here to give legal advice. We're not going to mention everything that happened during the Supreme Court oral arguments. It's very complicated, and we will be posting a JWsurvey article as well as some of the documents related to this case. But there's a lot of very complicated issues, and we're only going to be able to touch on a few of the core issues and sort of discuss these among ourselves and hope that we can answer some questions after the program.
Am I right in saying that the oral arguments will be that the Montana State Supreme Court IT department is putting together a video that will be available so that people can watch the oral arguments if they want to?
Yes. So I spoke to the Montana Supreme Court clerk this morning, and also the IT department. And I do have the audio already, so we can make the audio available officially from later today onwards. And they believe that they effectively hit the record button, which I hope we did today too.
Oh yeah, good point. We are recording this time. Yeah, that's an inside joke, by the way. Still,
yes.
I'm still raw on that, Mark, but go on.
Yes, always hit the record button. And so the IT department for Montana actually said the same thing to me today. He basically said, yeah, I hope I hit the record button. So I believe by tomorrow, the raw footage that they shot, which is not going to be a high resolution, it's just going to be their camera, their webcam pointed at the proceedings. So that will give people an opportunity to look at those arguments, listen to them. And I will say that, we are getting legal advice from the attorneys and others involved in this. So we will try our best to answer those questions. The attorneys who are involved in this, while the Supreme Court is reviewing those oral arguments, those attorneys can't go public. They've been asked not to speak to the media, so you're not going to see these attorneys. They wanted to be on our program today, but unfortunately, because of the Montana Supreme Court request, we have to honor that. They have to honor it.
Sure. So once the video is available, I will make sure for the sake of completeness, that a link is included in the description below. It's possible that when this video goes up that it's still not ready, but I will certainly update the description later on as soon as the link is available. Mark, Covert and I were talking before you came on the call, and we were saying that, and please feel free to correct me here, we sensed almost that you were a little bit downbeat in your social media posts as regards, you know, the prospects for the case being overturned. Do you think that there's a realistic possibility that Joel Taylor has won over the Supreme Court?
Well, I wouldn't go that far. I would say that I am cautiously optimistic on behalf of the plaintiffs, and I will also say that there are multiple outcomes to this. And so, you know, if we review the issues of the case and what those possible outcomes are, there's quite a few. So, you know, let's discuss what those issues are and break them down. First of all, there's the issue of causation. Watchtower is claiming that they didn't properly have a chance to defend themselves before this case went to court, went before a jury in 2018, in September of last year. They're saying that the judge had ruled, which we believe is correct, that Watchtower had failed to report this child abuse according to Montana's annotated code. And because the judge ruled that Watchtower was in violation of that code, he instructed the jury that they were in violation of the code and that they were to rule on damages such as negligence and malice. And Watchtower is saying that's not fair. You know, that causation had not been established. They're saying that causation should have been placed into the hands of the jury to let them decide. And so when you listen to these oral arguments that took place, you're going to hear that issue brought up first and foremost, causation. The second issue is confidentiality. So Montana has a code that says clergy must report child abuse, except if it falls under the confidentiality clause. And I can actually read to you. We can also provide a link to the Montana annotated code. This one happens to be 2015. It's, I believe, the one that Watchtower is relying upon. And I won't read all of the code, but just the relevant part. It says professionals and officials required to report are, and then it lists ABC, teachers, doctors, etc. And then finally it says letter H, this is 2H, member of the clergy as defined in Montana Code 15-6-201. Okay, so sounds good. A clergyman must report. However, then they have exceptions. So then exception 6A or 6C says, a member of the clergy or priest is not required to make a report under this section if the communication is required to be confidential by canon law, church doctrine, or established church practice. So this is why you're going to hear during the oral arguments that Joel Taylor continuously refers to established church practice. And they do this in every state. Doesn't matter if it's Maryland, every state that has an exception, and many of them do, they're trying to claim that we have an established church practice of keeping the matter about child abuse confidential among our elders, and that we should be, that we apply, or section 6C of confidentiality exception applies to us. So that's the second issue. We have causation, we have confidentiality. The Watchtower says, hey, you know, they are trying to say we define what confidentiality is, whereas the plaintiffs' attorneys are saying, no, the court defines what confidentiality is. Then there's a third issue that came up, which is Montana's cap on punitive awards or damages. So as you mentioned earlier, $35 million was awarded, $4 million for negligence, $31 million for punitive damages or falls under malice. Montana has a law that says there's a cap of $10 million or 3% of net worth, whichever is less. So Watchtower is saying, look, even if you penalize us and charge us with malice, you can't charge us any more than $10 million because that violates Montana's law. Neil Smith and his law firm are saying, no, we believe that that law is unconstitutional, and that's why they're raising this issue with the Montana Supreme Court. So we have causation, confidentiality, we have the Montana cap. We also have the issue of vicarious liability. Watchtower is claiming that their agents in CCJW, the Christian Congregation of Jehovah's Witnesses, and Watchtower of New York, can't be vicariously liable for something that an elder in Montana or some other state did. They admit that this elder failed to report the child abuse of Lexi Nunez, for example, or Holly McGowan. But they're saying, look, we're outside of the state of Montana. You can't hold us responsible. Of course, the flip side of that argument is that they are the ones who actually instructed the elders not to report and have admittedly done so. In fact, they claim that the elders had neither the duty nor the right to report that abuse. So those four issues, and then there was one final issue that caught my attention, and that's the 1998 letter we can get into a little bit later, but there was a letter that was written in 1998 by Watchtower, and it was mailed to the Department of Health and Human Services of Montana. And in that letter, and I think Kim's got a copy of that letter and is going to talk about that, but in that letter, they actually asked the Department of Human Health and Services what were the exceptions to reporting child abuse in a number of different cases. So why is that significant? That is significant because in 1998, that's the year Holly said that there were rumors flying all over the place in the congregation that Max Reyes had abused people, and that she reported it herself to the elders, and they swept it under the rug. But suddenly, 3 months after the trial last year, Watchtower pulls this document out of their rear end and says, hey, to the court, sends it to the court and says, look, we're sorry, but we just happen to have found this document 3 months later. And this is proof that we try to comply with Montana's annotated reporting code because, look, we wrote to the Department of Health and Human Services and asked them under which conditions we should or shouldn't report child abuse. So those are the 5 things that were brought up, and we can discuss them individually or as a group, but some of it gets a little bit complicated and we don't want to really go there without one of the legal team present today.
Sure. So it sounds like this is a very complicated case, and Watchtower is trying to leverage, as you would in fairness expect them to, they're trying to leverage any potential reason to either overturn the ruling or reduce the amount that they have to pay. Kim, I know that you have watched the proceedings and you've taken a lot of notes. What do you think the strong points of Watchtower's defense are, and how do you rate their chances of success?
Well, look, it's obviously a little bit hard because I am used to the Australian judicial system, so I'll only comment based on what I purely observed and just the reactions of all parties involved. I definitely, my biggest concern is the issue in relation to confidentiality. I think that Mr. Malloy made an excellent argument in that, you know, the courts and the governments make decisions as regards what is acceptable practice and what the laws mean, and then it's up to churches to then comply with that. And I think that point that he made is quite reasonable, and I think it's fair because it protects the interests of the public, which is ultimately what the intent of all laws are, is to protect those who can't protect themselves, amongst other things. But so yeah, I thought it was very, very good. I thought that argument was very, very strong. I think that Watchtower haven't been able to adequately address the issue in respect of their practices. If you look at the way their practices have been sort of set out in the case, it's not, you know, it's almost like saying, well, here's our practice, but nobody polices it. So is it really a practice? Because if it was a practice, then it would have consequences. And we all know, in honesty, that there are consequences, and that elders don't report because they're told not to. And then if they do, there actually are consequences. However, they're stipulating to the court, and so I have to go based purely on the evidence put to the court, that this is our law, but really it's up to them to decide what they want to do. So therefore, we don't really have laws and we don't have practices as such. So I think that the confidentiality argument that they've put forward is a strong one, and I think that it probably will definitely help them in the situation. I do have a question for Mark, though, in respect of the constitutional challenge. It's something that I find very interesting, and many people in Australia will as well, in terms of like statutory limitations on penalties. Courts have got statutory penalties in Australia, and you can't, like, you know, the local court, for example, can fine up to 110,000, et cetera, but they seem to have issued a penalty higher than what the court can ordinarily issue. Is that correct in how we're interpreting that in Australia?
That's a very interesting question, and what I will say is that I was not aware of the cap while I was at trial, and there were no instructions to the jury that I'm aware of, or anything that happened in that courtroom a year ago, which, by the way, I was just looking at my calendar, and that was almost a year ago this week, or end of this week. So there was nothing that was said to the jury that indicated that you must abide by a certain financial cap. What happened was when they got to negligence, the jury deliberated and felt that $4 million was a fair judgment against Watchtower and CCJW for the negligence on their part in not reporting. So that was really cut and dry. It had nothing to do with malice. It was just, what is it that we can do to compensate the victim for this terrible thing that happened where they should have reported, they didn't, and Lexi ended up getting very badly hurt. So that's negligence. Then there was malice. So then the jury was instructed to go back into the court, into the jury deliberation room, and deliberate on the issue of whether Watchtower was malicious in their actions of intentionally telling those elders not to report. And that's where they came back with the $31 million. But the judge never said, and I don't know that he knew or even thought about it. It was the jury. They were presented with Watchtower's net worth. And by the way, that was Watchtower's stated net worth, which was $1.6 billion, or 1.590 and change. And I will say for the record that that didn't even get investigated by the plaintiff's legal team, by Lexi's legal team, because the figure was so high that they knew that that was satisfactory for the jury to say, look, they've got 1.6 billion in this corporation alone, and whatever the percentage is that they come up with that will send Watchtower a message, a punitive message, then that should be a sufficient sum of money to send that message. So the reality is that Watchtower could have a lot more money, and they never investigated that. They took Watchtower's word for it because the number was so high. But to answer your question, that really never came up until the trial was over, and then immediately someone said, hey, there's a $10 million or 3% cap on judgment, and that has become an issue for Watchtower and also for the plaintiff's legal team.
So that's where that constitutional argument or question has come into it, where they're saying, you know, this is an excellent opportunity for the court to silence and to empower juries and trial judges across the state on determining punitive damage claims.
So what it comes down to is that the law was designed to protect corporations from being unduly put out of business because of, let's say, one terrible incident that happened. Let's say you had an automobile manufacturer in Montana or wherever, and they did something very wrong, and a lot of people died because of the liability of their cars or their bad truck brakes or whatever the case. So obviously there was some negligence involved. If there's negligence, they need to pay for negligence. But if there's malice, if the automobile manufacturer, let's say they knew that they were buying cheap brake pads that were going to fall apart, but they took a risk and they did it anyway, then that's malicious. And so what they're trying to say is that we need to hold these corporations responsible, but we also have to limit it, because if the corporation's worth 100 billion, it's not necessarily fair to put an entire company out of business if not all of the people who work for that company are malicious. So you might have hundreds of people that work that have families, that they're relying on this income, and you put the entire company out of business. Where are these people going to go? So they have to put some sort of fair limitation on the judgments that happen, even if it's a judgment against malice, so that it's fair.
Yeah, and I think that's very reasonable, and I think that regulating it is fair enough, and it does provide that fair opportunity. But it also provides Watchtower with the opportunity to act fairly as well, where they, whether if victims continually come forward and make claims and make claims and make claims, and then they have to make, like damage payments, then that's their own doing. That's so that the court has been very fair to them. That it would be unreasonable for them to say that we are being unfairly treated. But it also provides them with the opportunity to address the faulty parts that they're purchasing and actually change their policy. So I think it's beneficial for two reasons. Firstly, victims, are compensated for the damages that are caused, but secondly, gives Watchtower an opportunity to look at their actions and change them.
And that's exactly why the law was intended that way. It's intended to be able to send a message to prevent organizations from engaging in activity that harms the public or harms their employees. And if you don't have these punitive damages, then what happens is it just continuously happens over and over again, because they feel, well, we can just write a check, for a couple of million and get away with it. So they give a jury the opportunity to send a message. And I think Watchtower really didn't think that jury was going to check the malice box. They pleaded with the jury. And I mean, Joel Taylor got up there at the end after the $4 million had already been judged against Watchtower. He got up there and gave a second speech and pleaded to the jury and said, Jehovah's Witnesses, we do hurricane relief work. We do everything. We, help people. It's our public ministry. Please, don't put us out of business. And it was at that point that they had just revealed the $1.6 billion net worth of Watchtower alone. And Neil Smith got up there and said, look, here's how attorneys look at it. If you have $100, what does it take for someone to take money away from you and send a message? Is it $10, $20? When are you going to get the message? And when are you going to feel it in your pocketbook? So Neil suggested 10%. Now, we know that it ended up not being 10% of Watchtower's net worth. It would have been, $160 million. But the reality is that the jury thought it was fair to penalize Watchtower $31 million out of $1.6 billion, because that still sends a message, but it's not unfair to Watchtower. It's a small amount of money. Of course, Watchtower doesn't look at it that way.
Sure, it's not. I think it's fantastic. It's not just about compensating the victim. It's, as you say, about making sure they know that they've done something wrong due to having to pay a large sum of money. Covert, I don't know how much of the proceedings you have watched. I've not watched all of it, but what I have seen was fairly remarkable from the performance of Joel Taylor, particularly the part, I don't know whether you saw this, where he was quoting scriptures to the Supreme Court judges. I think it was a scripture in Proverbs, justifying Watchtower's practice of keeping things confidential, as though this is kind of like, I rest my case, Your Honor, because I've cherry-picked these verses in defense of our policies. I don't know what you made of that.
Yeah, I mean, this is the kind of behavior that makes perfect sense if you're a Jehovah's Witness, but appears like an act of complete lunacy if you're not. And I remember, because I still do, I'm close enough to being a JW to remember that of course you'd be proud to stand up and proclaim from the Bible to the courts of Satan's world why you were or were not going to do something. But I can only imagine that if I was a Supreme Court justice who's extremely qualified in law, I'm probably not used to being lectured that way, as if I've accidentally stumbled into some kind of crazed street preacher's temple and I'm suddenly getting Bible verses flung at me like rocks. I can't imagine, and I can't see that it helped, because the scripture is irrelevant to what Montana state law says. the witnesses are either in compliance with law or it's illegal. And it's irrelevant if a scripture in Proverbs says, well, blah, 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 keep this confidential. If Montana state law says, no, you have to report that, then it's the Montana state law that the Supreme Court justices will pay attention to. So this is, and it's strange, isn't it? Because it's that little part of me that remembers being a Jehovah's Witness would think that that was a perfectly reasonable way to handle the situation. But now that I've left and I'm kind of a bit more aware of how the real world operates, I can only imagine that those Supreme Court justices must have been looking at this guy going, really? Really?
It's just so self-indulgent and juvenile and clearly subjective. This is one religion's policy or one religion's interpretation of a certain Bible verse. Any number of religions could have a different interpretation, and they're saying that their interpretation is the one that needs to not just be applied to them, but applied to all similar cases. Because let's bear in mind that cases of this kind set a precedent. But I was also thinking, where do you draw the line? You could, in theory, argue for stoning homosexuals if you're going to cite the Bible as an authority. You could say, well, based on Leviticus 20, verse 13, Your Honor, we were perfectly entitled to stone these gay people. I rest my case. So where on earth are you going to draw the line with that kind of strategy?
And it's kind of, and part of me thinks that Joel Taylor was showboating for the witness crowd. But then again, I don't know if maybe Watchtower is starting to get savvy that witnesses see this footage, because what happened with the Australian Royal Commission, they must be aware that so many JWs saw that footage and woke up. And this is why I love the fact that there's video footage of Watchtower lawyers in court, because you get to see the organization at what I think is its most cruel and vindictive. And it's not the organization that I think the side of the organization that most witnesses are used to seeing. But some part of me wonders if when you hear, because this has happened in other cases as well, when Watchtower lawyers go into this kind of scripture quoting, if really partly the intent is to try and I'm sure they are earnest in that they to some degree believe it, obviously, but also if they're showboating for the witness crowd, because Watchtower's worked out that footage of this will end up being seen by witnesses no matter how much they're told not to. So you have to put on that appearance of someone who's laying forth the scripture, so that even if you then lose the case, you can at least say, well, we presented the scriptural case, but Satan's world doesn't care what scripture is. I don't know how much of that makes up their part of their legal strategy, but I can't see from a tactical legal move, as you said, Lloyd. I mean, if I went out and smashed, someone who's gay over the head with a brick and then tried to justify it with Leviticus, I can't see that I'd be walking out of that courtroom. And so you can't establish a precedent in court where that scripture has any relevance, because what's important is what's on the Montana rule books and not what's in Proverbs.
Indeed.
Yeah, this was an issue that did come up during the Supreme Court hearing with the oral arguments on Friday, is what would happen is if you let a religion or any institution define the law themselves. And in other words, this whole topic, I think, of confidentiality is a very, very important topic, because Watchtower wants to define what confidentiality is, and the court wants the law to define what confidentiality is, and that's where they're butting heads. So one of the things that was mentioned during those arguments was that if you allow an organization to define confidentiality, then you can define it so broadly that it effectively can be used as a tool to cover up child abuse. So another way of saying it would be, if you say, look, we are telling the elders about this situation, we call that confidential within the congregation elder body, but then this other elder body knows about it because this perpetrator moved to another congregation. Then we're telling the Watchtower's legal department. Now, of course, they call that attorney-client privilege or confidentiality, but then they immediately get turned over to Watchtower or CCJW's elders service department in New York, so they all know, at least a group of men know what's going on, and they type it into their records, and other men have access to those records. And so you then can define confidentiality, which Watchtower is doing extremely broadly. And I want to mention something that was not brought up. In fact, I brought this to the attention of the attorneys, and I think they really wish they had this prior to the trial last year, because it's not something they can just enter into evidence right now at this point. But Watchtower's Shepherd the Flock of God manual very clearly specifies, there's a beautiful copy of this manual, thank you very much, very clearly specifies that the elders not only will tell each other and the service department about cases of abuse, but they will inform parents in the congregation that a person is a child molester if CCJW of New York designates that person as a known child molester. So if you look at the section on child abuse in the Shepherd the Flock, and this is a new 2019.
Yeah, it's a 1919 edition of.
Yes, yes. When
I'm not even
Babylon
going to
fell.
ask you where you got that from.
Yeah,
So-
we actually had these printed, but I'm not going to say where from. But we have these at our disposal.
It wasn't from Korea. So what it says there under child abuse, under restrictions, subsection 23, it says the service department will direct the elders to inform family heads of minors within the congregation of the need to monitor their children's interaction with the individual, meaning the child molester, the abuser. The elders would take this step only if directed to do so by the service department. The coordinator of the body of elders should ensure that newly appointed elders and elders who move into the congregation are made aware of the service department's direction regarding such individuals. So they not only tell new elders that are coming in and the entire elder body that there's a child molester in the congregation, but they will even inform parents, which is supposed to be their protection mechanism. But it breaks all confidentiality. In fact, they even script the words, and this is found in multiple body of elders letters. So here's a secret document called the S66, which is Child Protection Guidelines for Branch Office Service Desks. So this is an actual document which the elders who man the service department desks in New York and in other countries, they have this, 8-page document where they answer questions about child abuse, and they tell elders what to do. Well, inside that document, they actually script the words of what elders will tell a parent. And it says here, and it even has it in quote, but it says 2 elders should meet with each family head. The elders should adhere closely to the following wording. Quote, the elders want to assist you to care for your scriptural responsibility to protect your children. Thus, please review with your children the information found on pages 170 and 170 in the book Learn from the Great Teacher. With that counsel in mind, we encourage you to ensure that your child is never alone with, and then it says, name of person. So they're saying to parents, this guy is a child molester, and we want to ensure that you know about it and keep it confidential among your husband and wife. But the reality is that's not confidential, and the law doesn't say that's confidential. So you might have 50 people that know that someone's a child abuser, but Watchtower is saying, hey, we call that confidential. That's within our religiously established procedures to call that confidential, and that is why we tell the elders not to report child abuse to the authorities, because it falls under Montana subsection 6C, which says, hey, it's established church practice to keep that confidential. Oh, and I will mention one more thing. In the confidentiality issue, this is very important. So a lot of people might have questions about what Jim Malloy said. Now, Jim is the Montana attorney who also represented Lexi Nunez. And I know some people might be a little confused by that because they're used to hearing from Neil Smith and Ross Leonidakis and his team. But the Montana attorney who was handling this case also for Lexi Nunez and for Holly McGowan is Jim Malloy. Now, Jim is a longtime, very well-respected Montana attorney. He knows these members of the Supreme Court. He's been up before the Supreme Court on multiple occasions, and he's very precise in his understanding of Montana law. That's why they chose him. But he said something that some people are going to disagree with, and you might not understand. So one of the things that Jim Malloy said is that Watchtower's own representative, Doug Chappell, said that elders are free to report child abuse to the authorities. Now, you might be wondering, why would Jim Malloy, the attorney for the plaintiff, knowing that Watchtower elders are not free to pick up the phone and call the police, why would he say that they are free to pick up the phone? The reason is because that's what Watchtower's own representative, Doug Chappell, said during testimony. So Jim Malloy is using Watchtower's own testimony against them because they claimed that elders are free to report. Now, of course, that's a lie. And if you listen to this entire hearing, you will see that Joel Taylor himself lied to the Supreme Court and said that there were no consequences for a person, i.e. an elder, picking up the phone and calling the authorities. In fact, he sort of sidestepped the whole issue by saying, well, that's between that person and God, meaning the elder and God. But the fact that Doug Chappell said that the elders were free to report, what Jim's point was, is that if you're saying that the elders are free to report, then your elders are breaking confidence. So there's no confidentiality if they're free to report to the authorities. That was the point that he was trying to make.
I did watch that part, actually, and I did struggle a little bit with what he was saying, but then it kind of clicked as to what he was doing. And what he was doing was saying, you can't have it both ways.
Correct.
You can't say, we're a religion and we have these confidentiality policies and therefore you can't hold us to account. And then at the same time be saying, well, we don't keep things so confidential that an elder can't go and tell the police. So you can't make, we've discussed this before, Watchtower is always doing this, where they try to have it both ways in making their legal arguments. And I think that even though we know that elders face penalties when they do report abuse, it was very astute of Jim Malloy to draw that to the attention of the Supreme Court.
Yeah, I had a massive problem with that. The other thing that Mr. Taylor said was that, I've lost my train of thought. Where was I going? Talk amongst yourselves.
Was it the fact that Joel Taylor specifically said that elders were free to report and that the justices questioned him on that, and he kind of sidestepped it? Go ahead.
That was
Kim.
a very interesting point, but the point that it's come back to me is that he stipulated that whilst they notify the congregation that someone has been reproved, they don't provide any information as to why that person has been reproved. I don't think he used the term reproved, but we all know that's what he meant. And so he was using this as another double speak to say, oh, no, we protect confidentiality because we don't share. But at the same time, we all know, as you pointed out correctly, Mark, through the Shepherd's book, that elders then go around and speak individually with families. It's not an unreasonable bow to draw if you're saying, Max Reyes has been reproved. We recommend you don't hang around with Max Reyes. It's quite clear that the elders are telling you that this person has committed an offence. That's very, very serious, a crime. And as so I don't agree that the confidentiality clause should apply to Watchtower. I think that they are very, very dangerous. And one of the justices towards the end questioned Mr. Taylor about it. And it was a question of fact in respect of the religious use of confidentiality as a shield. And so I think that the justice was very clear, or had some very clear suspicions that they were using that just in order to shield themselves from the liability that they absolutely have. It's along the way, there was a little favours where the justices were asking questions that mainly indicate that they were concerned with this lack of absolute practice that they have through no consequences for actions, through the double issues that we've discussed. And I just don't think that the Watchtower are going to be allowed to get away with that.
Yeah, and I hope you're right, Kim. I think it's a very important issue. And of course, we all wanted to stand up and throw rocks at Joel Taylor when he claimed I mean, it just, and I'll have to say, I was sitting next to Lexi for the entire duration of the Supreme Court hearing. And I want to give a shout out to the whole family, to Lexi and her husband, Jared, and their 3-month-old newborn baby, which she had in her arms. She and Jared had in her arms the whole time. She's a very strong woman. She's been through a lot. And Holly was just terrific. You know, Holly was there, and Ivy, and also Tracy Rector, who is Neil's assistant, you know, has just been terrific at being such a kind and supportive person to these women. And also, I want to mention something that I've been wanting to publish, but haven't had the chance to do it yet. So a few weeks ago, both Holly and Lexi were recognized by the Montana Trial Lawyers Association, and they have both won the Person of the Year award for the state of Montana.
Brilliant.
Oh,
this
fantastic.
is a big deal. Yeah, and I'm going to publish, I have some photos of their awards. Holly wasn't able to attend last month or a few weeks ago when they awarded this to her, so she wrote a speech, and I have a copy of the speech. And look, you know, I have to say, none of this would have happened if Holly hadn't gotten this all started and said enough is enough. And I mean, she's been through so much with Watchtower, and I don't mean just the trial, because you know, I sat there through the tearful testimony of Holly and Lexi for that week. They had to testify, but this is not the first time. They had to give depositions prior to the trial. And attorney Joel Taylor and his team just ran them through the ringer. And that's very common. They tried to do it to Stephanie Fessler in her case. They tried to include things about her past that are, you know, that are supposedly detrimental to her case. And yet a lot of this behavior is a direct result of the abuse. So Watchtower is effectively trying to take things in their life that happened to them or that they did and use it against them when that behavior is a direct result of being sexually molested as a child. It is just horrendous that they treat these women as perpetrators when these women are victims. And let me tell you something else that came up, and you know, especially with Lexi. I don't know if you all caught this, but there was a point during the oral arguments where Watchtower, and they've made this claim before, they have said Watchtower and CCJW did not even know of the existence of Lexi Nunez, and therefore should not be held liable for what some elder named Don Herberger did or didn't do, even though we told him not to contact the police. They said, hey, you know, sure, Max Reyes, he admitted to abusing Holly and Peter, and they disfellowshipped him and then immediately reinstated him. Sure, we know that, but we didn't even know of the existence of Lexi Nunez. And that is so infuriating that we have a religion that says that God looks after his lost sheep, that Jesus said that, you know, you would go after the one sheep out of the 99 in the herd that were there, and then one sheep strayed, and that God would look after that one sheep and go after that person. And Watchtower of New York and CCJW says, we don't even know, we didn't know of the existence. How could we protect her? We didn't know of the existence of Lexi Nunez. Well, they know who Lexi Nunez is now, but I think it's criminal that they treated her this way. We've discussed this in other Watchtower in Focus episodes where we talked about the publisher ID arrangement. Watchtower knows these people. They have records on every single Jehovah's Witness in the world. And they have this, if you're a publisher.
Well, they do now. That's yeah.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. And of course, Watchtower would make the argument that, well, you know, back then, maybe we didn't have this computer arrangement. But believe me, she's turning in field service time, reporting it to the elders. The elders are reporting that to New York. The circuit overseer knows what's going on. They know she's a congregation publisher. They know she's abused. Watchtower says, nah, you know, we're not responsible for what happened to Lexi Nunez. And that's why they need to be held responsible.
It is an astonishing contrast when you have the state of Montana recognizing with an award Lexi and Holly, and on the other hand, their religion is using such callous, clumsy, flippant wording in a lawsuit, saying things like we didn't even know of their existence. You know, how can you? This is Caesar's world giving these women the recognition they deserve when they're basically thrown under the bus by their religion. It's astonishing, isn't it?
The other thing that really bugged me just around that section of the case that Mark is referring to is that they were talking about, I think it was causation, dissection in respect, and they were talking about the percentage responsibility of her mother, and that just astounded me. I thought, are you kidding? You're going to stand there and victim blame. You're going to blame everybody else except yourselves. And I can understand that obviously there's money involved, but we're talking about, you know, a God-fearing Christian organisation where they, like Mark said, you know, they care about that one sheep that went amiss, but they just didn't give any consideration. They were going to continue to victim blame and blame her mother as if her mother doesn't have enough. I mean, I don't know her mother personally. I shouldn't speak for her, but as a mother, I couldn't imagine that she would feel fantastic about herself. Although there are circumstances that I do know of where you know, women aren't always in the best interest of their children, but I don't believe that's the case in this situation. And I just think it shows, like Lloyd, you were making the point about how you know, CCJW, Watchtower are treating these victims, and then you look at how the world are treating these victims, and these victims are being shown compassion. And I think it's so important that the ex-JW community also show those people compassion, because they've absolutely been, you know, they've often like had multiple, you know, as Mike said, multiple depositions, multiple trials, multiple, you know, they've been to the kangaroo courts that we call judicial committees and had to give evidence. They've been through so much stuff and perpetuated mistake after mistake as a result of the abuse. And so, you know, it's just so important that they be treated with the ultimate respect, because they've been absolutely treated so badly by this organisation.
But you raise an interesting point, Kim, that they in the courtroom started to try to pin the blame on the mother. Isn't that exactly what they said in the May 2019 Watchtower, where they said it's the responsibility of the parents? So it seems that the official line that Watchtower keeps pushing, that their hands are clean because if anything goes wrong, it's all on the parents. And they said that as well, I believe, in a convention talk. Yeah. I think it was in 2017. This is the line that they keep pushing. So I guess in a way, it's no surprise that they try and push it in court.
Well, this is the thing with... Oops, sorry, after you, Kim.
No, you go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, this is the thing we keep seeing with Watchtower. This is the way they approach everything. They demand all of the authority. They want the authority to control every aspect of the lives of Jehovah's Witnesses, but they accept none of the responsibility when it goes wrong.
Exactly.
Now, it doesn't work.
Yeah,
and I think this is just one. I mean, this is one of the most serious aspects of this. You know, you can think of alongside with blood transfusions. But just generally, that's the Watchtower attitude. We demand the right to control every aspect of your life. But if something we say goes wrong, that's not our fault. That's your fault. You know,
or the elders, or your parents, or, you know, with the world, or, you know, Satan's system of being the court system, corruption. There's every excuse. And the thing that really got up my nose in that part of the trial also was that, you know, Mr. Taylor went on about redemption value, and that, you know, that's the whole point, is that the people, you know, the confidentiality has to be there, because they need to have redemption value, as if it's part of the scriptural practices of Jehovah's Witness. But it kept grating with me, because I sat there and thought, hang on a minute, what about keeping the congregation clean? What about protecting Jehovah's sheep? You know, it just I'm sorry, but it just doesn't sit well with me. That redemption, it seems to me like they're reinventing an organisation. And for anyone that doesn't know, I've only been out of the organisation for 1 year. And to me, I mean, I am only a lowly woman, I get that. And I'm obviously not privy to the men's business. But that's my understanding, was that, you know, the whole purpose of a judicial and all of these actions and Watchtower being involved with every aspect of our life was in order to keep the congregation clean. So I'm confused. If anyone can help me out with that, let me know.
The questions that probably only Watchtower can answer at this point. Yeah.
Makes me
I think
cranky. Sorry.
you raise a really good point about the parents issue, and as Lloyd pointed out, that was what the recent Watchtower said. It's the parents' responsibility to report, and that is over and over and over again what they're saying. However, that's irrelevant. Of course, if you're a parent, you would want to report, but there are many and complicated circumstances that involve a child that's abused. For example, the parent themselves, one of the parents may be the abuser, and the other parent, the non-abuser, may be in a very, very difficult situation where, let's say, the husband is the abuser and the wife is the non-abuser. Well, the wife may have a conflict of interest, and that's why she's afraid to report. She may be afraid that she could be severely beaten by her violent husband who also sexually abused their child, or she may be without any other financial resources and her husband's bringing in the money and she's crossing her fingers and hoping that he won't do this again to their child. So she has a conflict of interest, whereas when elders find out, they're supposed to be in a unbiased situation, an unbiased position where they're not family members. They see that a child has reported that they were touched or abused by someone. So the elders have to follow law, or teachers as well. You know, in the case of the JW versus Watchtower case that we discussed on a previous episode of Watchtower in Focus, it was the school principal who made that phone call, not the elders. The elders knew, they didn't report. It was the principal, because it's very, very difficult for parents to report their own spouse who abused their child. This is the case with Arkansas. You know, we've got a guy, we're going to talk about that case briefly later, but this guy, this elder, was abusing kids all over the place in multiple states, and his wife knew about it. And so she didn't report him, she covered for him. And it's likely she's under investigation from the authorities. I know she's under investigation from the authorities. So you can't just make a broad and sweeping statement and say that parents are reporters. That's irrelevant. The point is, we're not talking about parents, we're talking about what do the elders do? What is the state code that is a fair and reasonable law that says if you find out there's an allegation to report it to the authorities? This is not 100 years ago. This is now where we have extremely well-qualified forensic analysts, police department officials, people who know how to talk to children. They bring them into special rooms with toys, and they do all the right things. They know how to get this information from a child in a way that doesn't upset the child, unlike the elders who quite often used to place the child in front of their abuser and have them relive the horrors of the abuse that they suffered. So yeah, you cannot make the statement that parents report. Should they? Yes, of course they should. Any of us should. We're all, in a sense, mandatory reporters in that if we find out a child is abused, we should all report. We should do the right thing. Elders, by law, must do the right thing and stop trying to use this confidentiality exception, because it's only hurting more children and it's only making it worse for Watchtower.
So,
and there's just one last additional point on that, which is always struck me as someone mentioned it to me, and I thought was very pertinent. If the elders are essentially saying, well, it's okay, the other parent will report, we don't have to do anything. Well, would they say the same thing if, say, the father had shot and buried the child in the back garden? Would they say, oh, it's okay, we're sure the mother will report, we don't have to do anything? You know, it's like, it shows you it's this struggle. The organization does not seem to understand the seriousness of this crime, and the ethical responsibility that is upon any human being when they're aware that there's been a potentiality of something as serious as the abuse of a child. To just, oh, you know, it's not the whatever. It really doesn't make any sense. And
an organization that directs its elders to contact the police immediately if there is any damage to Kingdom Hall property, but somehow the same doesn't apply to abused children. It's
a
just
witnessing
astonishing.
card. A witnessing card report is much more important.
Indeed, a literature card, yeah. So at this point in the show, it's time to just take a slight change of direction, and this will also hopefully allow Mark to gather his thoughts and in his concluding comments later introduce anything that he perhaps, would have liked to have added at this point already. But it would be nice if we could welcome back the news reading genius that is Covert Fade.
And cue the music.
Oh dear.
Oh,
Getting more and more elaborate, but there we go.
Yeah, everyone's like, can Covert go back in that cave and study for a bit longer, please? Yeah, so we've got a couple of things to cover. And I thought we'd start off with, this is one news story that actually becomes two different news stories, but I'll start with the first part of it. There was a report on the Kiro 7 website about basically a field service incident that went a bit wrong in the US. And this is a town in Monroe in Washington in the United States where essentially a man and a younger woman come up to a family home. They ring the doorbell, and there's footage of this because it's one of those doorbells that captures audio. And the man says, we're looking for the family's 15-year-old daughter, and they ask for her by name. Now, quite understandably, the father of the girl is like, well, who on earth are you, and why are you asking for my daughter? And the man apparently said, oh, we're Jehovah's Witnesses, you just want to talk to her about the Bible. Well, the parents ask these people to leave because they're like, obviously we don't know who you are. How do you know our daughter? Why do you want to talk to her about the Bible? And they were concerned enough about this that they actually went to the parents go to the Kingdom Hall. They saw the man who had come up to their home, and the mother goes up to this particular Jehovah's Witness with a cell phone camera recording him and starts to demand, where did you get my daughter's name and address? And then she says that this man sort of tried to knock the phone out of her hand, inadvertently slapped her in the face, and he refused to answer the question as to where they got her daughter's name and address. And this is what Johnson says. She's quoted as saying, my concern was that he didn't identify where he was from. It scares me for my daughter. She's scared and she doesn't know. Now she's saying the daughter doesn't know how he got her name and address. So this is so what happens is the news reporter goes to the local congregation of Jehovah's Witnesses, where the spokesman Eric Larson, remember that name, we're going to come back to that. Spokesman Eric Larson actually kind of throws this JW under the bus and says, yeah, he shouldn't have done that. It wasn't our intention to be that intrusive, and they imply they're going to talk to the guy. So I thought we'd start by saying this is an example of how often Jehovah's Witnesses, because they're all required to do the ministry, that means that some of them, and I know from my own memories of being a Jehovah's Witness, some of them are very, very genuinely conscious of not wanting to offend or upset, and they will do their best not to be intrusive, and they'll be respectful of the householder. But other Jehovah's Witnesses will have very little understanding of personal boundaries, and they will be inappropriate. And I've never seen a field service call go quite this bad in my own personal experience. But I've certainly been on doorsteps where I've been cringing and just wanting to jump into a hole because it's all going off the rails because a witness is being intrusive or inappropriate. Who's doing the conversation, and I was just stood there wanting the ground to swallow me up. Did you guys ever have those experiences when you were on the door-to-door ministry?
Oh, where you're embarrassed
Yes.
by your partner all the time.
Yeah.
But I think in this case, I mean, it would have been creepy if another let's say a teenage Jehovah's Witness girl had been asking for the teenage girl. That would have been a little bit weird. But especially in the context of what we're discussing today, it's extremely creepy for some dude to be asking for your teenage daughter.
Mm-hmm. By name.
And what kind of adds insult to injury is the way they went about reporting this story by interviewing Eric Larson.
Yep.
Are we going to tie that together yet?
Part two? Should we do part two?
Yeah, let's jump to that, yeah.
When I saw that name, I sort of saw him on the report and I thought, that was weird because he's got like distinctive swept back hair, and you know how you sometimes get that momentary passing fleeting. I'm sure I've heard that name before, but it kind of flickered off into the distance. But then I saw a tweet from Jason Wynn saying, "Oh, it's ironic that they've interviewed Eric Larson, who has himself got form for stalking." And I was like, and of course, if we go to the John Cedars channel, is one of the many places this got covered. Fade Interrupted episode 3 with Brandon Fickett. Eric Larson was one of the elders who turned up on Brandon's door, and Brandon didn't know this guy.
Never met him.
Never met him before. And in fact, guys, go and watch Brandon's video on the John Cedars channel to get the full impact of this. And just started to have demanding information about Brandon's sex life.
Yeah. We'd like to know whether you're committing sexual immorality. Yeah, it's astonishing. And I actually tweeted to the reporter who covered the story, or I tweeted about it. I said, great report by, her name's Jessica O, and she is on Twitter. If only she'd known that Eric Larson, the JW spokesperson she interviewed, who insisted witnesses try not to be, quote, intrusive, is known to have doorstepped a guy he never met to ask about his sex life. I mean, the irony there is just,
Yeah, and then he went on the television program, the news broadcast, to actually defend the organization, and he implied that maybe that the elder or the brother didn't handle that properly, and kind of threw him under the bus. But as you say, it's very ironic because this Larson, he stalked Brandon Fickett multiple times in the evening. We have him on video taking photographs of Brandon's house, and the entire purpose was to get Brandon disfellowship so that would free his ex-wife to get remarried with what they call a scriptural divorce. And so they throw the ex-witness under the bus, you know, who's happens to be living with his fiance and her son, and they free the ex-wife down in Georgia. And as Covert mentioned, it was 3,000 miles away. Brandon doesn't know these people. He's minding his own business. And they ended up delivering certified mail to him, and they disfellowshipped him to people that he has no idea, has never met them before. But that's how much the organization, the lengths they will go to stalk and disfellowship an individual.
But it also says something about, you know, without wanting to be too unkind to Jessica O, it says something about the standards of journalism. I mean, if you're going to draw up a short list of people who are least qualified to talk about intrusiveness in a Jehovah's Witness context, those you'd struggle to find a name other than that's more inappropriate than Eric Larson, you know, based on what we've learned in the last few weeks. So it would be nice if journalists could just do a little bit more digging before they bring someone on like that. But that's just my opinion.
Yeah, I don't know how she would have known. You know, I wish we had done more of a story on that and expanded on that a little bit. I don't know.
Maybe his name would have flagged up. Is that what you're saying?
It shows how prominent he is in the local Seattle area because, you know, he's a spokesman for the organization. He's one of the go-to elders. And, you know, he didn't even use the congregation's address. He used his business Allstate email and address on the disfellowshipping request letter, or the what do they call that? They sent certified letter to Brandon requesting that he go to a judicial hearing, and it was from Eric Larson at his business address. And I think some people have commented online to Allstate, you know, kind of explaining who this guy was. But I wish the press would cover this. This is why we have this issue of, you know, the constitutional rights of religions to just, they can seemingly do whatever they want. They can disfellowship, humiliate a person, break up their family, and do this all under the guise of religious freedoms. And that's exactly what Eric Larson did.
Yeah, so hopefully, I mean, like I said, and maybe we'll be seeing Eric again in future news reports. And yeah, we've got a little, if journalists are curious.
I think, hang on, he's at the bunker door right now. Just hang on a minute. Just, there we go.
Oh, that would be hilarious.
He's got a representative in Croatia.
Yeah. So that's the Eric Larson story, and maybe we'll be seeing more of him in future stalking stories. So moving on to the next item I just wanted to cover, and this is actually quite this is another US-based story, and this is quite concerning. We've covered this before, and I think it's been obviously on the XJW Reddit. This is reported in Kimono News in Seattle. There's an ongoing spate of arson attacks on Kingdom Halls and Assembly Halls in the area. They've been going on. They say they basically there's a reward out at the moment. The FBI's put $25,000 as a total reward of $61,000. Also, the ATF's involved because this person's been not only setting fire to Kingdom Halls but actually firing live ammunition into them.
Wow.
Yeah, there's not obviously we don't know exactly who this person is. The obvious speculation, I stress it is speculation, is that this might be somebody who's had a bad experience with Jehovah's Witnesses. I mean, admittedly, it might just be someone who's had a weird mental breakdown, who's never met a witness before. But I think the suspicion and the unfortunate is that might be someone who's got a grudge against the witnesses. The FBI certainly seem to think so. But I think this is I bring this up because I think the issue here is that this person, whatever their grudge and whatever's happened to them, and what's happened to them may be horrible. You don't solve that problem by endangering the lives of people by setting property on fire or firing live ammunition in a public space. I mean, endangering the loss of life. I mean, even if no lives are lost, ultimately this person will be caught and their own life is destroyed because now the FBI, the ATF are involved. There'll be a prison sentence here. So hopefully there will be no loss of life, but there is at least one life here that's been destroyed, and that's that of the perpetrator. And
you're like you say, even if no one dies or no one is injured, you're actually taking police officers or FBI agents away from investigating crimes where people are at risk, so that they can figure out who you are and they can come after you. So whichever way you look at it, even setting aside just how plainly irresponsible and vindictive it is to react in this way, you're essentially making yourself as bad as the cult that you are protesting if you're going to endanger people in this way. So I'm sure we all kind of would condemn that sort of behavior as in the strongest possible terms. I'm glad you've brought that up.
Yeah. And I'm just going to close this report by saying the ATF officials are saying this person's probably based in the Seattle area. They may have exhibited changes in behavior in the hours or days since the fires that may include altering physical appearance, a change in normal routines, missing work, unexplained injuries. And if we can maybe put a link to this report maybe in the show notes, because there are a number of hotlines you can call. So if you do think you know who this person might be, please contact the authorities, because we've just had an entire Watchtower in focus about how failure to report wrongdoing to the police has resulted in additional child abuse and suffering. Well, failure to report this may result in suffering again, or maybe even loss of life. So please, if you think you know who this person is, contact the authorities.
I think Kim might remember I think it was 1985 in Casula, where there was a Kingdom Hall bombing and a man lost his life. I think the speaker was blown up into the ceiling of the Kingdom Hall, and the attendant sitting in the front row was killed instantly by a bomb that was placed by a disgruntled man. Without getting into all the details, that man was not caught for some 30 years. I think it was just a few years ago they finally caught, because he was indicted in a series of a whole string of attacks on judges, a bombing of the Kingdom Hall. And I remember when that happened, we actually, years ago when I was in Australia, we drove by that Kingdom Hall in Casula, but it demonstrates that witnesses will take that event and use it as to say, well, these are the last days for being persecuted, and view that kind of
absolutely
spin it that way.
And the reality of that fact was that it had absolutely nothing to do with anything Watchtower. It was purely in relation to a marriage separation. custody battle with children. The husband felt aggrieved in regards to the determinations made by the court. He obviously had some issues in terms of mental health that obviously aren't disclosed, but I could still tell you the name of the brother who was doing the talk, or the gentleman who was doing the talk, part of my deprogramming language, the gentleman that was doing the talk. And it's, you know, it's still spoken of in Australia around the traps now, and that person's name gets mentioned, and you know, and it was, you know, just the beginning of times to come, and the amount of propaganda that got was absolutely ridiculous. It grew and grew and grew and grew and grew to this fantastic story that, you know, Armageddon's coming in 35 seconds. So, you know, I understand that this person may have ulterior motive, it may be personal, it may be non-related, but it certainly, if it is coming from the ex-JW community, I don't think that it's constructive. That my personal opinion is that I don't find it constructive to the message that we're trying to send. And Covert makes an excellent point. If you know about it, do something, because this is how we got to where we are with Watchtower.
It would be constructive to turn this guy in, definitely.
Absolutely. Because once you know better, you have to do better. And we now know better. We're not part of a cult anymore. We know better, so we have to do better.
Very well said.
And going on to that, the last little bit of news report. This comes from News Ghana, and this is to deal with the ongoing incident with witnesses being arrested in Eritrea. It reports that there are 52 of them that have been imprisoned. None of them have been charged with a crime or appeared in court. And it goes on to list a number of them that have been incarcerated. Some of them have been there for 25 years. Numerous UN human rights bodies have tried to get them freed, or to at least get some kind of legal process implemented, and nothing's happened so far. I just bring it up because Eritrea doesn't get much coverage in the news. We tend to focus on other countries sometimes. But this is an example of how the tragedy that often Jehovah's Witnesses, they're victimized once by the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society, by the men who run that society. And then they get victimized again if a government just decides to, you know, grab them and throw them in jail for 25 years without even giving them due process or telling them what the crime they're accused of. And I just want to draw the contrast between the way that the witnesses are being treated in Eritrea, which is without due process, without fair trial, and the way that the Watchtower is being treated in the case we've just discussed, where they have, although this is a civil case, this is not a criminal case, they have legal representation. Watchtower is allowed to make its arguments, and everyone knows the law. The laws are there to protect citizens, keep them free, and hold people to account. And we can see the difference there, I think, in there's one way to deal with Jehovah's, the cult that is damaging the witnesses, whereas the approach that's being taken in Montana is to hold the leadership and the organization responsible for the harm it is doing to the witnesses. And so I put that in the news because I thought that was a contrast, I think, between methods and outcomes, which was worth bringing up.
Indeed.
So that brings us to the end of the news. I believe I'm going to hand it over to Mark, who has a little bit more to talk about on that front.
Thanks, Covert. Appreciate that. And now for the weather. The weather in Arkansas is not looking good for Rod Watkins, who has been accused of and arrested for the sexual abuse of at least 4 minors. Actually, one of them is not a minor anymore. So we covered this on a previous episode of Watchtower in Focus, and also there's a JWsurvey article. And I'd like to bring everybody...
Sorry, can I just apologize for pronouncing it Arkansas in that episode? I'm not even going to try and explain why. I'm British.
You're not living that one down, mate. You're not going to live that one down.
Anyway, it's Arkansas. I recognize that now. Go ahead.
Well, I'm quite sure if there were a variety of states in Croatia that none of us would be able to properly, pronounce those names either. So, or even some of the British towns that you're familiar with. Anyway, so we covered the case of Roderick or Roddy Watkins in a JWsurvey article and on Watchtower in Focus. And so a lot of things happened since that article came out on JWsurvey. what I had originally reported on was the fact that this man had been arrested on multiple counts of child abuse of Jehovah's Witness children. He was an elder. We believe he was also a special pioneer. He was the service overseer. He was a convention overseer. He had multiple levels of responsibility. He had been a Bethelite for a number of years. I've spoken to a lot of people who responded to the JWsurvey article, including victims and family members of victims in Indiana, which at the time we did not know how bad the abuse was in Indiana, because he actually was sponsored by Watchtower to live in the Kingdom Hall in that Indiana congregation, where, as it turns out, he sexually molested who knows how many young Jehovah's Witness boys that he was conducting Bible studies with. And they were not conducting Bible studies during the visits to that home, that residence, which was an apartment inside of the Kingdom Hall. And I don't have the name of the congregation in front of me, so don't need to mention it anyway. So as a result of the survey article, additional victims and additional information have come forward, which has actually helped the police in Arkansas. But the latest news on that case is that as of 5 days ago, 20 different subpoenas have been issued in Heber Springs, Arkansas, and in other places for the criminal trial of Roderick Watkins, who is currently out on $100,000 bail. Police arrested him last November. He's out on bail. There's a criminal trial. It was scheduled for July. His attorney filed for a continuance. Now it's scheduled for October the 2nd and 3rd. All of these people, many of whom are victims or family members, including the police officer was part of the subpoena, have been subpoenaed to appear on October 2nd in Heber Springs, Arkansas. So I want to just mention that this is not going to be a public trial because there are minors involved and it's child abuse. So it's not going to be a deal where you can get on a plane and go sit through that trial unless something changes. It's going to be a privately held trial.
Would you go if it were different?
Most certainly I would, yes.
Yeah.
And, you know, there is an ongoing investigation of this case with the police and with some attorneys involving finding additional victims of this man, because there's many. In fact, the sister of, I've personally interviewed 2 of his victims in 2 different states. And what I learned was, it was some of the most gut-wrenching abuse that I've ever heard of in my life. And it's a phone call multiple phone calls that I would not want to have to repeat. And I just can't stress enough how horrendous it was that this man, with all of this responsibility, and he was not a lone creep that just occasionally attended a Kingdom Hall. He was a Bethelite, an elder, special pioneer, service overseer, assembly overseer, gave all these talks, he was a man that all of the single sisters in the congregation who had children would virtually throw their children at and say, oh, could you look after my son, conduct Bible studies with him? Some of them had multiple children, both of which, or many of them, were also abused by this man, Watkins. More details are coming forward. So if anyone has information about Rod Watkins in Arkansas, Indiana, Missouri, New York, or North Carolina, where he is from, please reach out to law enforcement in Cleburne County, Arkansas, or in your local jurisdiction, because we know that there are many more victims of this. And if you're not sure who to reach out to, you can contact us at Survey, but we encourage you to go to law enforcement and tell them what you know and let law enforcement handle this. So we'll say that the trial is scheduled to begin October 2nd. We don't know for sure if there's going to be another continuance. The police investigator told me that it's likely that it could go on for 18 months to 2 years. And that's often how the attorneys for these persons that commit these crimes have the ability to file continuances for an extended period of time until the judge finally says, that's enough, we're going to trial. So it may go to trial October 2nd, it may not, but multiple subpoenas have been issued. So I want to thank everyone who responded. There's been a lot of people who wrote to me after the survey article. It's had a big impact on people coming forward and people in Indiana didn't know what was going on in Arkansas and vice versa. And I know there's other states involved. So, I just want to thank those who responded and spoke out. Some of them were actually family members of Watkins who came forward. So we have a lot of good information, but we need more.
It's a good, it's heartening to know that by putting the word out as we try to do both on JWsurvey and on Watchtower in Focus, that it can have that effect where, more people come forward and law enforcement is able to do its thing. So yeah, really, really encouraging to see that. And we will, of course, stay on top of the story on Watchtower in Focus when we're able to provide any meaningful updates. As regards, just coming back to the Montana appeal, again, when I was reading because you wrote a Facebook post about it with your kind of immediate thoughts, and I forget what your exact wording was, but you suggested that this could drag on for a long time. How long do you think it will take before we get resolution on this case?
It's a very good question, Lloyd. So in talking to all of the attorneys involved in this case, we believe that a minimum of 4 months will go by before any decision is rendered by the 7 justices of the Montana Supreme Court. And by the way, there were 4 men and 3 women. 2 of those men were beard wearers. So you've got Watchtower going up against 2 men with beards, 3 women, and 2 other guys that might pass for JWs. I just thought that was kind of funny that there's such an equality and justice there where, all of these Supreme Court members, are equally men and women, and they're interested in the law. Doesn't matter if they have a beard or a clean shaven, male or female. They're there to disseminate justice and make a fair and honest decision. We believe it's going to take 4 to 6 months before they'll render a decision. Now, you're probably wondering, what will the outcome or what are the possible outcomes be? This could go back to trial. If the Montana Supreme Court says that the issue of causation was not handled properly, then it could go back to the trial in Thompson Falls, and it could go back before the same judge, or they could request a new judge. So I'm going to read, here's Watchtower's argument. That was September 11th, 2018. So this is just before the trial began. Watchtower made the argument that the rulings removed causation from the jury and ordered plaintiffs to proceed to damages. Trial begins September 24th, 2018. The district court ignored the need to have the jury find whether petitioners' alleged agents caused plaintiffs' injuries. So I mentioned this earlier. I just wanted to read it to our viewers. The causation issue is what Watchtower is saying. Look, the jury never had a fair chance to rule on that. The judge did this for them. And we think that the judge was rightly interpreting the law, that Watchtower did break the law, and that Lexi was involved in the class of individuals whom the law, the mandatory reporting law, was designed to protect. Watchtower is saying she's not. She's saying she's not in that class. Their attorneys, the plaintiff, Lexi's attorneys, is saying she's absolutely in that class. And the judge agreed, and Watchtower appealed, and the judge overruled that and said, no, the ruling stands. And that's when Watchtower back in January went to the Supreme Court of Montana and said, okay, we're filing an appeal to the Montana Supreme Court. Normally you would have intermediate courts in a state like California or Maryland, where it's a larger population state. But in Montana, you don't have any of those intermediate courts. You have the lower courts, you have the ruling, and then if that ruling needs an appeal, it goes right to the Montana Supreme Court.
Okay.
Sorry,
go on.
Just one more thing I want to, I don't know if we're doing concluding comments or not, but I want to mention one thing that is very important, that this case has already affected Montana law in a positive way. And this is found on the Montana Law Review online. So if you want to go, we'll provide a link to this, but Mr. Joseph Gresham produced a document for all of the people who attended this Supreme Court hearing, and it's available online. I don't know if you can see that, but it is at scholarship.law watchtower.umt.edu. You'll find it. We'll provide a link. But what is important about this document that summarizes the case is that this case has already affected Montana's law on mandatory reporting or failure to report child abuse. What it says is that during the 2019 legislative session this year, Governor Bullock signed HB 640, which updated laws relating to childhood sexual abuse, namely Montana's Child Abuse Reporting Statute. The legislator made the legislator made the punishment for failure to report child sexual abuse a felony and applied it retroactively. So this case has already affected Montana's law, making failure to report child abuse a felony in the state of Montana. And we've already reported about what happened in Delaware, because Delaware took their change in law very seriously, and they fined the elders $10,000 apiece for failure to report that Laurel, Delaware case. So now Montana has changed their law. Now I will say that it states that there is an exception for clergy if the information was intended to be part of a confidential communication between clergy and congregant. So again, they still have this clergy exception, but that has to be interpreted. So what needs to change is the language needs to be very specific to define, first of all, who defines confidentiality? Is it the law or is it the elders? Well, we know that it's the legal authorities, the legislature, that must define when something is confidential or when it is not confidential. So I thought that was a very positive outcome. Hopefully I answered your question about time frame. It's 4 to 6 months before the Supreme Court will likely render a decision, although they could do so earlier. And the case could go back to trial. I'm not suggesting that it will, but that is a possibility, particularly if they agree with Watchtower's assessment on the confidentiality. If they say that the confidentiality exception applies, then yes, it could potentially go back to another jury in Montana and we could start all over again.
Well, whatever happens on this story, I think it's reasonable to say that we will be doing another episode, and depending on what restrictions they face, or Neil faces, it would be lovely to have Neil back, because I think he explained very clearly what the situation was when we last had him on the show. So no, we will be revisiting this story, but it is time to give our concluding thoughts. Kim, again, you've scoured over what's been going on in these proceedings, and albeit from an Aussie perspective, what do you make of it, having heard Mark's observations?
Yeah, look, I just on that last point about confidentiality, I would be very, very surprised, on a personal opinion, I'll be very, very surprised if the court do find that Watchtower can determine what confidentiality means. I just thought I'd spend like a couple of minutes just in my closing talking about the comments made by justices, because sometimes you can get some understanding of, you know, how the case is going if you analyse their comments. So obviously one of them was concerned in regards to acting in furtherance of principal's interest, and I think it was in respect of Mark, help me out here. Agent, you know, whether or not they were Watchtower's agent, and, you know, and they were very interested in that. So I found that very interesting. So what they're saying is that, you know, you weren't necessarily, or the question was, you weren't necessarily acting in interest of the victim, you were looking out for Watchtower's best interest. So I found that interesting. Obviously, the comment made by the justice in respect of the confidentiality clause being used as a shield, I found that very interesting. I thought that was not in favour of Watchtower. And there was also a point that was, you know, made that if you're going to rely upon the exemptions, the confidentiality exemptions, that you need to comply with all aspects of it, as opposed to Watchtower's attempt to try and partially comply, but sort of comply. I found that interesting. I was irritated very badly when the Watchtower solicitor, I've forgotten his name, Mr. Taylor, referenced that in terms of notifying those parties, you know, who are party to the offence being occurred, he referred to them as victimised by sin. I really still don't think Watchtower have a clue that they're actually dealing with a crime, and that really bugged me. And that would bug a justice. I can say that you know, they will be looking at that going, I still don't think they've got it. And in terms of protecting children, which is ultimately what the legislation is there to do, I think that they've missed the mark. And also just on touching on that document that Mark alluded to earlier in relation to the information that was lodged after trial. Mark, is that okay if I talk about that?
Please do.
Okay,
yes.
So Joel Taylor lodged what you call an affidavit, isn't it? Anyway, and he references that he gives an explanation as regards that after the trial, one of his clerks found additional information that was from some years ago, from 20 years ago, and that he tried to have that document submitted as evidence after the case had been concluded. But I believe before judgment had been issued. Is that correct, Mark?
I didn't get the last part of what you said. Oh, you mean that the judgment was issued, right?
Yes, it was before judgment had been issued, but after the case had concluded.
Well, the case had concluded, and Watchtower did appeal the decision, but the judge upheld that decision. Maybe your question is, at what point did they uphold the...
Yes. No, at what point did they try and have the additional information submitted to the court?
I do know that it was it was 3 months after the September, it was some point in December. It was, 3 months after the trial had ended, they produced this 1998 letter and said, by the way, we have a 20-year document destruction cycle, and 1998 to 2018, that's 20 years. So basically Joel Taylor said, hey, I found this document in my office and we think it'll help our case.
Yeah, and so what he's referring to is interpretation of various child abuse reporting statuses, and you know, it was almost as he's written it sort of with the flavour that, you know, we care about, you know, victims. He's also conceded that there was an opinion supplied by Mark Hudson, who was the administrator of Montana's Department of Public Health and Human Services at that time. And so in the request letter that was made back in March 26, 1998, Watchtower's attorney was asking for opinions on the following questions, and there's a series of questions that are asked. The questions are not particularly interesting. I found one of them unusual in respect of, you know, do they have a reporting requirement in relation to children, minor children who have married? I don't quite understand why that's relevant, but anyway, that's what they asked. The thing that's important to note and there's, you know, obviously there's a subsequent answer in May 12, 1998. I think the important thing to conclude here is that it was just an opinion. They asked for an opinion. If you look at the wording in the end of paragraph 1 of Watchtower's letter to the department, and then in their response, they also provide an opinion. So it's only an opinion, and it doesn't appear to have been provided by someone of a legal qualification. I can't confirm or deny, but it doesn't appear so. The point that I wanted to make about that was, and the reason why it raised an interest with me is because Mr. Malloy, one of the justices, asked a question in respect of, what do you have to say about the documents that, you know, have subsequently tried to be entered as evidence? And he jumped on it really quickly. And it made me wonder whether or not there was some sort of smoking gun behind the scenes that Watchtower had that he was trying to suppress. And that's obviously what generated my interest. But I think it's more the fact, and I just wanted to bring this out. So if there is someone like me who has that thought of, what does this document, you know, entail? You know, what is it that Watchtower have that we don't know about? It's just more misinformation. It's only an opinion, and I think it's just another attempt for Watchtower to red herring, which is something we know they do on a regular basis. And as Mr. Malloy quite correctly pointed out, in the case, misinformation is not an excuse, and it doesn't negate responsibility. So simply because you may have been given incorrect advice. It doesn't mean that you're not liable. And I think it is completely irrelevant. And I just thought it was really important that people that had that question had picked up on the same point as me, that had the opportunity. That's, to me, important information. That is all.
No, thank you so much. I found that fascinating because I haven't looked at that 1998 document yet. And it does appear like it was an attempt to just sabotage the process there. Covert,
it just was muddying the waters.
Indeed. Covert, do you have any thoughts on what we've been listening to?
Well, it's interesting because I've been sat here and I'm very bad at following legal stuff. I'm a bear of very little brain. But what did come out to me is just basically, again,
you're basically you're into news reading, aren't you? Let's face it. Not necessarily.
I don't understand news. I just read news. I don't actually know what it's talking about.
You're a beautiful voice.
Oh, thank you. But I read it beautifully. But the thing that kind of came out to me was the contrast between when you get Watchtower in a courtroom, you see the mask come off. Because the face they try and present to the Jehovah's Witnesses, like if you read the Watchtower article, that infamous article where they tried to present their current policy on child protection as being, the elders endeavor to report to the police is one of the phrases. And they made it sound like they were all very much up for the protection of the flock and everything was fine. But when you get them in court, you see the mask come off and you see this organization that is desperate not to report this abuse and is desperate for the inverted commas world to have no part of them dealing with this problem. They want to handle it all internally. They don't want anything to get out, probably because they don't want inverted commas shame brought on Jehovah's name, which I think is one of the factors which keeps causing them to have this problem. And I just find it fascinating. And I love the fact that this is recorded, that the testimony is going to be viewable. People can hear the audio, because I think the more audio, the Royal Commission was damning in terms of the audio and the video footage. So many believing witnesses watched that, and it was the start of them waking up when they saw the ugly other side of the organization. And I think it's once again, we basically get to see what happens when Watchtower is put in a court, and when the mask comes off and you see the nasty side. And I think what we've essentially seen here is the nasty side of an organization that is willing to try and find every single loophole it can to avoid reporting child abuse to the authorities, and is prepared to absolutely drag abuse survivors through the mud in order to try and not be held accountable for the damage that it has caused. Well
said. And Mark, if you could give your concluding comments, but I do just want to ask one question before you do that. Covert's just raised the point that, in this appeal, which has been filmed, and again, we'll have the video in reasonable quality available soon, and there will be a link in the description. This video will be embarrassing for Watchtower, regardless of how Watchtower may want to kind of produce their own clips of it in future, particularly with the scripture quoting. But do you think, having been there and having been in the room when Taylor was giving his arguments, do you think I'm going to be able to use any of this material to do a sequel to my Theocratic Warfare video, in which I gave video examples of Watchtower representatives lying? Is there footage in there that could be featured in that kind of video?
Yes, absolutely. In fact, we brought this up as soon as the hearing was over. Within minutes, the plaintiff's attorney, Lexi's attorney, Jim Malloy from Montana, very, very nice man, by the way, just a very strong legal mind. His brother's a judge. He's got a very strong legal background, and he's a genuinely humble, kind person. I couldn't believe it, how fine a person he was. Well, I could believe it. Came up to me after the hearing and was just very gracious, and we discussed this very issue. And I said, I think we all wanted to throw rocks when we heard Joel Taylor say that there were no consequences to an individual who made their own report, meaning an elder. And that's who he was really referring to, an elder, a mandatory reporter going to the authorities. He lied to the 7 members of the Montana Supreme Court and said that there were no consequences to filing a mandatory report on child abuse. That was an outright lie. He obfuscated, tried to confuse the Montana Supreme Court. I think they're going to figure that out. What they do with that information, I don't know. But yes, they are going to, you are going to be able to use that in your theocratic warfare for sure. Let's hope we get, let's hope we get good audio. Jim's a great guy. So I want to just say it, you know, I woke up the next morning to the Billings Gazette newspaper, and on the front page, we have church appeals,
$35 million abuse verdicts. Yeah.
Yeah. So it, you know, it made the Billings paper, but it also made the Washington Post and a lot of other newspapers. It even made the Baltimore News here in Maryland. Hearst Media was doing their own report on it, although they didn't get interviews, obviously, with the plaintiffs and the attorneys, but they did do a report on it. And it is becoming widespread in areas where people may not have previously heard about it, just like people didn't automatically hear about the Australian Royal Commission. So we're glad that it's getting publicity. I wanted to just say thank you to Kim for reviewing a little bit about that 1998 letter. That letter was a Hail Mary passed by Watchtower in an attempt to tell the court, look, we attempted to ask questions about mandatory reporting, but they're lying. What they're really saying is we're looking for the exceptions to reporting. In every case, Watchtower is always looking for an exception so that they don't have to report and they can keep these matters internal. That is the purpose of that 1998 letter. The judge said, no, we don't want to admit that. It's way past the trial, your window for admitting that. And the reality is it really wouldn't have helped them anyway, because either way, they broke Montana's statutory mandatory abuse reporting law. The final thing I'd like to say is a lot of people tear their hair out and say, why is Watchtower doing this? Why are Jehovah's Witnesses continuously failing to report child abuse? And to use your phrase, Lloyd, to do a little scripture quoting, I'm going to have to do a little scripture quoting here, because their philosophy behind this non-reporting of abuse and keeping things in-house is all based on 1 Corinthians chapter 6. So this scripture says, 1 Corinthians 6, the Apostle Paul says, does any one of you have a dispute with one another, dare to go to court before unrighteous men, before the holy ones? Or do you not know that the holy ones will judge the world? And if the world is to be judged by you, are you not competent to try very trivial matters? Do you not know that we will judge angels? Then why not matters of this life? If then you do have matters of this life to be tried, it is the men looked down on in the congregation whom you assign as judges. I am speaking to move you to shame. Is there not one wise man among you who is able to judge between his brothers? Instead, brother goes to court against brother, and before unbelievers at that. Really, then it's a defeat for you when you have lawsuits with one another. Why not rather let yourselves be wronged? Why do you not rather let yourselves be defrauded? Instead, you wrong and defraud, and your brothers at that. So that's 1 Corinthians 6, 1-8. I want to raise that because this is the religiously held belief of Jehovah's Witnesses, that these anointed ones, meaning the governing body and their anointed friends, are above the law. They are going to judge the world, they believe, and that there shouldn't be disputes in the congregation. They should be handled internally. They should not go to outside judges, as it says here, but they should be handled within themselves. Trust in Jehovah that your arrangement will work. And additionally, they're relying upon the First Amendment of the United States and the First Amendment, or the equivalent in other countries, so that they can conduct their religious affairs internally, including calling whatever confidential they want. So I think people should have an opportunity to read those scriptures, whether you believe in the Bible or not. My point is that that's what they are relying upon in saying we are above the law and that we're going to handle things the way that we want to handle them. And that's why they're before the Montana Supreme Court, because they told this elder and this body of elders not to report. child abuse, and they've admitted to doing it.
But that verse that you've just read is also the reason why you can't try and pin it all on the parents, because Jehovah's Witness parents are under the assumption that it's wrong to take another believer to court. That's the culture that they are indoctrinated into if they're raised as witnesses, that it would be wrong, that they should allow themselves to be wronged and allow themselves to be defrauded rather than pursue their legal interests against a fellow believer. So that's yet another reason why it's wrong to pin it all on the parents, because the parents are thinking, even if this guy did this thing to my children, I've got to allow myself to be wronged in this instance.
I agree completely, Lloyd. It's all about undue influence, and the fact that when you talk to survivors like Holly and Lexi and others, they love these people in their congregation. They were friends. They grew up with them. They went hiking in the mountains and picked elderberries, and they did all these things with these people like Don Herberger, the elder who never reported that abuse. And Watchtower has effectively thrown him under the bus and says, well, if anybody's responsible, first it's the parents, but then Herberger, he didn't report. And look, it's a sad, sad situation that these elders' hands are tied, even though they know that they should do the right thing. But if they do the right thing, they will not be elders. They'll lose their position. So it puts everybody in a terrible position.
As we saw happen in Ireland.
It did, and those elders in Dublin lost their position as elders because they spoke to the police, and it happens.
It feels like things are coming full circle, because we're now referencing things that we've actually done Watchtower in Focus episodes on. We did a whole episode on that, didn't we?
We did. So, but thank you, Lloyd, for the making the channel available to talk about this story. It was big news. I mean, the Montana Supreme Court only handles a half a dozen cases a year or more, not that many more. It's a rare thing, and it will affect the laws in the state of Montana, and eventually they will rewrite these confidentiality exceptions, and they'll fix the problem. But it took a Jehovah's Witness case to come before the Montana Supreme Court before this ever saw the light of day. And the Jehovah's Witnesses
and further to that, Mark, it also took the bravery of some young women to come forward and make that case exist. So, you've got to give them credit too.
Absolutely. They are heroes, as Neil's assistant, Tracy, likes to refer to them. They are absolutely heroes because they've put their life on the line. Their whole people know who they are. They had to go in front of that jury, and it was a horrible, horrible, tearful thing that they had to talk about in front of that jury, and that jury sent a message, but it just didn't end with that trial, because now they're back in front of the Supreme Court, and it's going to go on and on and on. And we don't want this to define their life, but we do want them to be seen as heroes for what they've done. But it directly affects, I mean, these people have lives, and they want to get on with their lives. And yet they're doing this brave and powerful thing to stand up to a multi-billion-dollar religious corporation that has, effectively damaged their lives when it was completely unnecessary. Just let the authorities do their job. What harm could have come to Watchtower by letting the authorities handle the case? But
I think the answer to that question is that Watchtower don't consider them the authorities. They consider themselves the authorities.
Yes, that's right. That all goes back to 1 Corinthians chapter 6, and that's their philosophy.
So, Holly and Lexi, if you're watching, we salute you. You are heroes. We will always be grateful for you finding the courage to stand up, not just for your rights, but also for the rights and for the needs of countless young ones in this organization. But that's pretty much everything that we've got for you today. I'd like to thank my panel, Covert Fade, Mark O'Donnell, and Kim Silvio, for some wonderful insights. Thank you.
Thanks, Lloyd.
Thanks,
Great
Lloyd.
to be here.
So viewers, I hope you've enjoyed this episode. Don't forget to subscribe to the John Cedars channel for more such episodes. But for now, thank you so much for watching.
Say to the world that